Hello, and welcome to Ending Physician Overwhelm. I'm your host, Dr. Megan Mello. I'm a family and obesity medicine physician, as well as a certified life coach for physicians. In this podcast, we talk about how the learned habits of people-pleasing, perfectionism, and a lack of boundaries show up in our lives and how they contribute to burnout, exhaustion, and overwhelm. The healthcare system is broken, my friends, but let's not wait for it to be fixed in order to feel better. Hello, my friends, and welcome to today's episode of Ending Physician Overwhelm. Today, we're going to be talking about a final way to look at habit change. If you haven't listened to this month's episodes, the prior episodes, we're talking all about things habits this month. And so I invite you to go ahead and listen today and then go back and catch other episodes as well. But today, we're really going to talk about committing to the process. So for many years, when I would want to be making a change, the way that I would think about goals in my head would sound something like this. I'm going to try to work on the airplane. I'm going to try training for a 5K. I'm going to try going to bed earlier. Are you someone who has a habit of trying? I know that I am. And I've always been someone who had goals or outcomes that I wanted to work for. And yet, like so many of us, I often struggle with the follow through. And this is especially true if the goal or the outcome that I'm looking at is something that primarily benefits me, such as exercising or sleeping better, being more efficient with charting, you name it. It's true that these things can have ripple effects that might help others, but as a recovering people pleaser, it's always been easier for me to meet the expectations of others than it has been for me to meet my own expectations, my own goals. And if we're in the habit of setting big goals or sometimes multiple big goals, and we're focused more on the goals than the behaviors necessary to meet the goals, it becomes relatively easy to fail, especially as we become busier in life. And when we fail at those things, then we often start giving up on ourselves. So as we wrap up this month's theme of habits, today we're going to focus on a different spin for those of you who struggle with this facet of habit work. I know I'm not alone here. And the good news is that there's another route to take, again, especially when the goal is something that matters most to you rather than to the other humans around you. My hope is that this episode sparks some new insights on how to make progress. So let's dive in. As I mentioned, this habit of trying for a goal was a huge problem for me for years and can still be a trouble spot from time to time. And it usually stemmed from me focusing more on the goal rather than committing to the process. Now, at times, focusing on the goal is very helpful, especially when there's some kind of external accountability to the process, such as graduating from medical school. We had to accomplish certain milestones. We had to pass our classes, we had to pass the step tests, we had to do well on rotations. And knowing that this was true, we could get ourselves to sit down and study for many, many hours. But for so many of us, when it comes to being accountable to ourselves for a goal, we often feel like we fail miserably. And often the person who suffers is us. I would argue that we suffer a double hit because not only do we fail to achieve the goal, which again is hoping to help ourselves in some way, but we often suffer a ding to our self-image. And I don't know about you, self-image has been something that I've struggled with for a long time. And it certainly didn't get any easier, in this world of likes and Google reviews and all the things that we're encountering on a day-to-day basis. But rather than just give up here, I invite you to try a new tactic. Let's identify the goal as a starting point, just as we have before. But rather than focus on the goal and keeping the goal in front of us all the time, today we're really going to focus on the process. That is the actual actions that move you forward. My business coach likes to say that we set the goal, and then once we've figured out the process steps, we throw the goal away. We stop thinking about it. This can sound counterintuitive, but it follows some real logic. Let's say that we have a goal to train for a 5K. And maybe we've tried a 5K, couch to 5K program before, but it didn't work. And we don't want to repeat that, but we need to start with something simple. What does someone who runs 5Ks do? They run, and they usually run regularly. If I don't currently exercise at all, then jumping into running probably isn't the place to start, right? But focusing on the regularly part seems like a reasonable place to start. So let's commit to walking regularly. I can then sit down and decide how long to walk, how far, how often am I going to do it, and where it goes in my schedule. And that's important. Yes, it does need to be put on the schedule. And then I commit to the process of walking regularly and focus my problem solving on that. How can I stay focused on walking regularly rather than training for a 5K? I don't have to think about the 5K anymore. I just need to think about getting the walking done regularly. Let me give you an example. As I was preparing for this episode, I was sitting on a plane returning home from Boston, a long cross-country flight back to Seattle. I worked all week preparing for the talk that I was giving. And this morning, or rather yesterday morning now, before the flight, I decided I wasn't going to do any work during the day. I was just going to go out exploring. And I found myself in a familiar pattern that morning of hoping that I would get some work done on the plane. It was a long cross-country flight. My hope was that I would get this podcast episode written and some other work that needs to go out for the next month. And of course, once I was on the plane, I started dragging my feet. I don't know what to write about. I just deserve to relax, all the things, all the familiar loopholes. But finally, I pulled out my computer and I opened a fresh document and I just committed to starting to write. And the result is this episode. It went through a few iterations. It turned out differently than how it did at the beginning. That's okay. It was possible that I would pull out my computer and it would not result in an episode. That's definitely happened to me before. I have time set aside to write. I write stuff and it doesn't end up working out. And yet it was still important for me to pull out my computer and sit with the blank page, because if I don't do this, if I didn't show up to write, right, if I wasn't committed to the process, then there would never be an episode. The habit of writing regularly is necessary in order to fulfill the goal of having a podcast. If I always waited for a stroke of genius to occur, there would also be no podcast. I've learned that instead I need to sit down and write regularly and be willing to move paragraphs around. I delete sometimes. Sometimes I'll even write a whole episode and sometimes even record it and then throw it away because it just doesn't seem like it works. But committing to the act of writing allows me to publish episodes every week. And, as of the time that I'm recording this, I'm about a year in, a little over a year. This is going to be episode, I think 57. And so I've been able to commit to the process of writing and recording regularly and really stay focused on that. And that has allowed me to successfully be a podcast host. The sneaky awesome part of committing to the process is that it shifts your identity without you having to focus on shifting your identity. Now, many of you know that I am obesity medicine trained. And so I spend a lot of time talking with patients about weight loss and, kind of their metabolic health. And sometimes when I sit down with patients to talk about this, I have them imagine their future self, the version of them who has lost the weight and no longer has to take blood pressure medicines. I ask them to imagine thinking about what that version of them knows. And this can help them, what that version of themselves knows about their body, knows about what it took to get to that space, and that helps them give them some insight on where to get started. But a lot of patients really struggle to do this. This isn't the way that most of us think about problem solving. And sometimes it can seem too big, too overwhelming for people to think about. And I see that with clients as well. As physicians, we want to set big, impressive goals, and we want to crush them. But again, when it comes to changing something that largely impacts only ourselves, such as a healthy habit or working more effectively, sometimes it can feel like too much, too overwhelming to try, and we stop before we even start. But if we go back to the 5K example, and I'm committing to the process of walking regularly, and I've given myself some specific parameters, then I'm shifting myself into someone who's exercising regularly, just like the people who run 5Ks, and probably without even really thinking about it. As I find myself walking regularly, it's possible that I will choose to walk longer, or I'll increase the speed, or maybe I'll even sprinkle in a little bit of jogging. Because I've had success in committing to the process, the habit of walking regularly, I have more skills in place, more self confidence, all of which makes it more likely that I'll become somebody who completes a 5K. Another benefit of this method is that I become someone who exercises regularly, who is committed to the process and not the discrete goal. And therefore, I'm going to continue the process even if I achieve the goal. And that's different from what happens for many people who fail to sustain the habits once the goal is met. If I run a 5K, if I lose 20 pounds, and I'm really thrilled with that accomplishment, I might, be motivated to try for another race, or, to try for a little bit more weight, or, do something more. But because I achieved my goal, I might stop following through with the habit, right? Because I met the goal. Remember keeping textbooks from college or medical school, thinking that you would come back to them because at the time you were in the habit of reading them regularly, studying and preparing for tests. But once you took that test, there's no reason to sustain the habit, or at least not an externally motivated one, right? You're not going to be tested on that again, for example. And I would bet that most of those books never get touched again, because goals have a finish line. When we meet the goal, there's a part of our brain that decides that we're finished and we don't have to sustain the habit. But contrast this with the person who's committed to the habit of exercise, right? From getting out and, following through on the process. They're not fixated on the goal. And so it's possible that they'll still go and complete a 5K, but because the focus is on the process, being the person who exercises regularly, they return to the process. A final perk of this method is that it bypasses some of the common loopholes that we may use to get out of follow through on a given day. Let's say I signed up for the 5K and it's 3 months away, but I don't know, today I'm feeling tired. I have the thought, it's okay if I don't go today. There's plenty of time. The goal feels far away, and it's easy to tell myself that not following through today won't make a difference, which in the big picture is true. But stack up a lot of not todays, and suddenly we are not ready for that 5K when the time comes. In contrast, if today's Monday, and I'm committed to walking on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Saturdays, and I'm tired, but I'm committed to the process, it's likely easier for me to meet the bare minimum, even if it's just a short walk that day. I get to be proud of myself for sticking with the plan, even if I barely broke a sweat. Again, there is the benefit here that I learn how to navigate obstacles without giving up. I again build my self-confidence, and ultimately I'm more likely to become the person that I want to be when I set the goal of running a 5K more easily than if I'm focused on the goal and then give up when I meet the goal. In other words, I create solid habits, exercising regularly, publishing regularly, being more effective, which allows me to more regularly meet and possibly even exceed the goals, because the goals just become mile markers along the path rather than finish lines. And if we consider that most goals that we want are really not one-off achievements, but steps in the journey, committing to the process supports our long-term growth. We may have thought of finishing medical school, as a discrete goal, but ultimately the goal was really to become a practicing physician, right? And physicians don't actually stop learning. We've had to figure out how to keep learning outside of school, right? On the job, learning at conferences and, kind of as we go and as we see more things and take care of more patients. Just to say that we've done this before, we've learned how to commit to the process of, lifelong learning in order to, continue the practice of medicine even after we met the goal of completing medical school. So that wraps us up for today. I hope that this is a helpful reframe of thinking about habits. And I hope that this month's series has, really been useful for you in order to think about, the ways that you take care of yourselves differently. I know that many of the physician clients that I work with struggle with follow through. And again, especially on things that matter mostly to them, things that they want more of in their life. And so I hope that you found some ideas that will help you to feel more effective in those processes. So feel free to return to the episodes whenever you need a refresh. I wish you all a wonderful week. Bye-bye for now.
Well, that's our show for today. Thank you as always for listening. To learn more about my coaching programs, head to www.healthierforgood.com. And if you love this podcast, please drop us a review on iTunes or support the show by clicking the link in the show notes. Until next time, take care.